Buenas tardes, good evening. I'm the director of the Institución Libre de Enseñanza, the Free Institution of Education. We welcome you to this seminar series that starts with today's talk by Fernando Vallespín and will continue over the month of March. I want to thank Manuel Muñiz, the Secretary of State for Global Spain, for joining us in this opening session. We are tuning in with all of you from the headquarters of the Institución Libre de Enseñanza in Madrid, which is a private institution that was created in 1876 by Francisco Giner de los Ríos and other professors who had been removed from their university chairs as a consequence of the defense of freedom of expression. The purpose of the institution was to modernize late 19th century Spain through education, science, and culture. The Institución Libre de Enseñanza played an essential role in shaping Spanish life between 1876 and 1936. Its modernization project implemented the most advanced pedagogical, scientific, and cultural theories and practices from across the globe. After the end of the Spanish Civil War in 1939, the Institución Libre de Enseñanza was outlawed by the Francoist government. With the reinstatement of democracy at the end of the 1970s, the institution resumed its activity in order to ensure its intellectual legacy and to update it for present-day society. A key component of this moral and intellectual legacy is sustained since its origins by notions of coexistence, respect, cosmopolitanism, international cooperation, peaceful resolution of conflicts, dialogue, in short, tolerance. These values were part of the thought and action of Francisco Giner de los Ríos and his collaborators at the Institución Libre de Enseñanza and have continually inspired our work. The seminar series that begins today is part of this line of inquiry. Through research projects, workshops, seminars, and conferences, we will bring to the fore the relevance of these values and project them into the future. On the web, Democracy and Tolerance, you will find more information about the program. I am especially pleased to thank Professor Fernando Vallespín for his work devising and coordinating this seminar series. We are very glad to have been able to bring together such an accomplished group of internationally recognized experts, whom we also thank for their participation. This seminar could not have been carried out without the help of the State Secretary for Global Spain and the Residencia de Estudiantes, whom we thank for the collaboration too. Finally, thank you very much to all of you following us online. We encourage you to use the chat to raise your comments. And if you have questions for the speaker, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the page. At the end of each session, we will try to answer as many as possible. We hope to see many of you in the coming sessions of this series. Now, I give the floor to the State Secretary. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to the Institución for the very kind invitation to say a few words. I'm going to be very brief because, in fact, you're very fortunate to have one of the sharpest minds that I've listened and read on the topic of liberal democracy and political philosophy from Professor Vallespin. So his will be the task to cover the most substantive areas of the discussion. But coming from a foreign ministry, I want to frame the debate the discussion and the sessions that you're about to have today and in the coming days within a broader discussion about how the future of liberal democracy is not just relevant from a domestic point of view, from the point of view of how we govern ourselves and how we govern our societies, but is in fact a structural, systemic debate at the moment. I would in fact argue, I'm going to make the case in a minute, that is one of the central discussions in global affairs. Spain has just produced its foreign policy strategy, which will cover the next 4 years of our foreign policy. And in it, basically we state that the defining feature of the last 10 to 15 to 20 years in global politics has been in fact the slow erosion and collapse of the international liberal order, manifested in the weakening of multilateralism and multilateral institutions, from the WHO to the WTO, the trade organization, to the reversal of regional integration processes, fundamentally the process of European integration, but also others regionally in other places around the world, and also a domestic perspective, which is the weakening of the democratic case and of democracy in the Western world itself. Perhaps the most evident case of this was in fact what we saw on the 6th of January in Washington, D.C. with the assault on the Capitol, which is to a large extent a consequence of the weakening of institutional legitimacy within democracy. So this is the backdrop to global politics. And if in the 90s we were all speaking about the end of history, maybe not all of us, but as you probably know, and many of you have read, the very popular book by Francis Fukuyama, claiming that liberal democracy and open markets would basically steamroll through the world, and it was almost inevitable that eventually, if not all, almost the totality of societies around the world would be governed through liberal democratic systems, and would be made up of open markets and capitalist economies. If that was the thesis at the end of the Cold War, definitely today the picture is very different, and we're witnessing the return of history, and this is now a central debate to global affairs. Now, why is this occurring? Our thesis, and this is in fact contained also in the foreign policy strategies, there are two processes here. One is the rise of illiberal powers in the world, authoritarian powers, non-democratic powers. And the second is internal, which is the implosion of the liberal order from within, which is linked to the process that I was mentioning before of the weakening of democracy within democratic powers. I'm going to focus on the internal process, on this idea of implosion, because I think it's the most worrying, and it's in fact the one with the widest ranging consequences. Why are we seeing this in the West? Why do we see this level of political polarization in our political debate, this level of questioning of the legitimacy and efficacy of some of our institutions within the Western world, and why is that inspiring a foreign policy that is so revisionist and that seeks to upend or undo a large part of that architecture that we've built, all of us together, and by us I mean fundamentally the Western world, but not exclusively, since the end of the Second World War? The answer to this question is a very long one. I'm sure Professor Vallespin and others, and some of your other speakers will address this throughout the seminar. I would posit, and I would leave you with the thought, because I don't have time to go into this, and I'm sure you're going to see it in other sessions, that there's a fracturing of our social contract that is very much behind the politics that we're living in the West. And if I could summarize this in one phrase, there is something to our economic model, to the change of our economic model produced fundamentally by technology, but also by globalization, that is leading to the slow erosion and hollowing out of our middle class. And it's the weakening and the growing precariousness of our middle class that is leading to the hollowing out of the middle of our political spectrum. So these tendencies are correlated, and this is leading to a radicalization of our politics that is in turn producing this political convulsion that I was describing at first. Now, 2 quick points. What does COVID do to this? Because, I mean, we're all aware, I mean, I just took off my mask, but we're all aware that we're living under these very extraordinary circumstances due to COVID. I think COVID is an accelerator of these trends, or can be a great accelerator of these trends, at the very least, for 2 reasons. One, because if not managed properly, COVID can be a force for social division. It has a very unequal impact across social groupings. Just to give you an example of this, about 3/4 of the employment that has been displaced here in Spain because of COVID was precarious employment, short-term contracts, low-paid jobs. We know that the impact of COVID on rural communities that have little access to public services is most severe. We know it affects single-parent homes most gravely because there's no way of distributing the task of taking care of children. We know that it increases the educational gap, particularly in households that have little access to digital technologies. So we know that if we don't build a response to COVID that takes these things into account, it will widen the social gaps that were producing the fracture that I described before. It's also a huge boon to disinformation and to the questioning of institutional legitimacy and capacity. Just in the period from the month of March last year when this began to around the summer of 2020, we saw in those 3-4 months about a quarter's worth of all the disinformation of the last 5 years, COVID related. There's been a huge wave of disinformation linked to this, seeking to make us question our capacity to respond to the crisis, the motives of our political leaders when implementing policy, the ability of authoritarian regimes to deal with this much more effectively than democracies, etc., etc., etc. Now, a final point on how to respond to this, because I don't want to leave you all somewhat worried and thinking that there's in fact no way to deal with these things, because there are these structural forces that are producing this change in global politics. There are many ways in which we can respond. In fact, this is a problem of dealing with complexity and a problem of dealing with abundance and prosperity, because if you look at the macro figures and data of the effect of the liberal international order, of private property, of innovation, of technology, we're much wealthier, much more prosperous at the aggregate level, so we have a distributive issue. Now, Spain has structured its foreign policy along 4 key axes that seek to respond to this. The first is to promote, defend, and uphold the democracy, human rights, the rights of minorities, and the rights of women around the world. The second is to build a new social contract globally, economic social contract, through the advancement of initiatives to tax digital activity, new forms of measurement of growth beyond GDP, and many, many others. The third is to build a green economy and a sustainable planet. And the fourth is to forward regional integration processes like Europe's, and also to support multilateralism across the board. If every country that can pursued a foreign policy so determined to resolve the sustainability issues within the international order in the way that we're going to seek to do in the next 4 years, I think the impact would be great. And our public debate would be very different in some years to come. So I'll leave it at that. It's an honor to open this seminar, and I'm thrilled to see an institution like the one that is convening you today discussing this issue, and I cannot emphasize enough how central this is now to global politics and to the way that we conduct diplomacy and our foreign policy. So thank you, everybody. I hope you enjoy the seminar. Thank you for the invitation, and I leave you in the good hands of Professor Vallespín. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State. And I'd like to make also a special thanks to the Institución Libre de Enseñanza for having thought of me in order to coordinate this seminar. Just before entering into my subject, just a very brief introduction to this seminar, and I think there's something I would particularly like to underline. We've called it liberal democracy, digital democracy, so we wanted to underline that the main change that is transforming our societies is technology, and I think the Secretary of State referred to it before. I think this is relevant, but then the subtitle is current transformations of democracy. We have excluded titles such as the end of democracy, the crisis of democracy, the fragility of democracy. As you know, those are some of the titles that we can find in any bookstore nowadays. So our main aim in this seminar is trying to think about democracy and its many problems. We don't want to underestimate, the enormous amount of problems that democratic systems are facing, but we want to do it coolly. We want to make it, to keep our brain cold. We live in a highly emotional world, and I think it's very important to face these kind of issues from this other perspective, a more academic perspective. And that's what we want to discuss with you. We're extremely thankful that so many people have subscribed to our webinar. I hope they enjoy it. And as you know, because you have subscribed to it, I'm not going to present any of the names. You know them already and the subjects. What we try to do is to pick up the right people in order to talk to the different topics, or the topics that we thought that were relevant for this overall issue. And okay, that's it for the introduction. So I'll get into my subject immediately, because we don't have that much time. I don't know if you can, yeah. Here it is. So my lecture will have to do with the restructuring of the public sphere. So it's just one part of the transformations of democracy, and I think it's an important part of the transformations of democracy. And I start with a definition of the public sphere, because I think it's not that clear what we refer to when we talk about the public sphere. Well, in general, it is the place for discussing political issues, for opinion formation. And this is particularly important for developing political judgment. So the aim of joining the public sphere is getting enough information, or getting up cues or evidence, and orient ourselves on political positions and issues of civil interest. Of course, we can also incorporate here one of the demands that any democracy has to satisfy, following Robert Dahl, which is the criterion of enlightened understanding, meaning by that the possibility that any citizen knows enough about the workings of democratic institutions, and about how to introduce their interests, how to maximize them, how to join others in order to follow civic ends or whatever. But it's also, and this will be relevant to my discussion, this is also the realm of public debate. So this is the realm of where the public conversation takes place. And of course, the main ideal regarding this public conversation, or regarding this debate, is that our debates are guided by rational discussion. And ideally, and following Jürgen Habermas, as is well known, trying to be convinced by the force of the best argument, which is hardly ever achieved, as you probably know. Well, this is when I refer to the public sphere, I refer to that sphere. So it's mainly a place that incorporates lots of nuances, lots of dimensions. So, and what we have, the main transformation has been regarding the public sphere. The main transformation we we've titled this presentation, The Restructuring of the Public Sphere. So this restructuring has mainly been produced by the change from media democracy to digital democracy. Of course, by the development of the new communication technologies, which have transformed totally the public sphere. And so I will follow some of the main traits of this new or this restructuring of the public sphere. First, what we see here is the emergence of what Habermas again calls disorganized public sphere, referring to the loss of a common public world and its substitution by fragmented media consumerism through social media, what we call the logic of the swarm, by a highly privatized use of this new media. That's what Negroponte called, we can decide my daily me or daily me, so we can get the information that suits us individually, not that it has to be consumed for everybody. And of course, the famous echo chambers. So I'm not going to enter deeply into that. But the results of this new restructuring of the public sphere is increasing balkanization, polarization, the increasing presence as well of emotions, of fuss. And I'll also like to stress three more aspects, which are the creation of virtual communities. This has a lot to do with echo chambers, so that people get together with those with whom they have things in common. I love the name echo chamber because that's something, when you say in an echo chamber, Trump is great, then you hear the echo, great, Trump is great. So it really defines what's going on in the echo chamber. But then the second point is that here we don't find arguments. We find a reactive language, hardly any dialogues. And third, what we perceive is a reinforcement of polarization, of resentment, of hate speech, and something which is absolutely new and which I particularly find interesting, which is that this new virtual reality has also become the object of the traditional, the observations of the traditional media, so to say, so that we have created a parallel reality, so to say. The traditional media was, so to say, made a second observation of what was happening and what we usually call the reality. And now what we find is that media also observe how the social media react to what's going on in actual reality. So we have so to say, we have the traditional media contemplating how reality impacts on social media and in general on the internet. And this, I think, strengthens even more their influence. So what are the effects of what I've been calling the restructuring of the public sphere? Well, first, I think this has created a continuous loss of what we may call auctoritas, of authority, suffered by every stance or domain of power. Here we can also incorporate the what has been called the end of the expert. So we'll talk a lot about technocracy and expertise in this seminar. So I don't want to enter too deeply into this, but what we can find is that that positions that used to have authority have lost part of it and are being attacked as, in order to reduce the possibility that they are authoritized to hold the positions that they have. So if we recall the continuous fights between Trump and Fauci, when during the COVID crisis in the United States, here we have a perfect example of that. But the second, that loss of authority, that loss of auctoritas, has also affected traditional communication media, which are, of course, affected by what we may call a crisis of intermediation. So the traditional media are no longer the exclusive gatekeepers. This German sociologist called Niklas Luhmann, who holds the idea that everything that we know about the world, we know about the media, right? So I think this statement is no longer true. What we know about the world, we know about the traditional media, but we know about, of course, direct observation, and of course nowadays increasingly by the internet. Then we come to the third point, which I think is the relevant one because it will connect to some of the main points of my presentation, which is that there's an enormous offer of information. There is an enormous offer of medial excitement, whereas on the one hand, but on the other hand, as we know, there's an enormous limitation of the human attention span, right? So we cannot read everything that we would like to read. We cannot attend all the media that we'd love to attend. So the media market or the public sphere has a problem with the economy of attention. I think this is quite relevant because it immediately poses the question, then a question which is, what gets more attention? And because if you get attention, if you're read, if you're watched, you earn money, you become important, you become influential. So this, I'd like to start by a quote by Howard Rheingold. I think it's pretty well known, but still, I think it fits perfectly into what I'm going to say when he says, attention is a limited resource, so pay attention to where you pay attention, right? And he said that in 1993. So in 2021, so this is even more true. So this is important because it affects what to inform about, what is worthy of achieving the status of news. So amongst the almost infinite possibilities of talking about the world, so we tend to select those that are potentially perfect in order to gain greater attention. But second, just as importantly, is how to inform. So what staging tools to use when we present the news or we present the discussion. So what wrapping will be used to transmit what is newsworthy. Of course, media are subject as well to the requirements of surprise, of the happening, of dramatization, of storytelling, of aestheticization, and to an increasingly accelerating dynamics. Everything's accelerated. How much does a trending topic last? Nowadays, probably a couple of hours. They used to last for a day. Some of them even lasted for a couple of days. Now it's sometimes just a question of half an hour. So this accelerating. So media dynamics have always been accelerated, but in this case, the acceleration is total. Of course, scandalization also sells, but what sells particularly well, and this is the next step that I'm going to take, what sells particularly well is, of course, emotionality. So, and it sells so well, and it's so present in our political discussions that Neil Ferguson has also proposed the term democracy in order to describe our current democracies. Well, he recognizes that the first to use the term was his wife, Hirsi Ali, whom you probably know. So we've entered what within the social sciences has been called the affective turn. So now the problem that we have to face is how to differentiate between emotions and cognition. So the traditional distinction between pathos and logos. So and here let me quote Ferguson when he talks about his democracy. He says, "We no longer live in a democracy; we live in an immocracy, where emotions matter more than majority rule, and feelings matter more than reason. The stronger the feelings, the better you are at working yourself into a fit of indignation, the more influence you have. And never use words where emojis will do." End of the quote. So this is, I think, rather dramatically how our emotional situation has been described. But well, there are many, and then an enormous amount on part of cognitive psychology regarding the way we use emotions. And I think the results so far have been that there's a practical impossibility of distinguishing reason from affects. Thinking and feeling always appear intertwined in one way or another. We incorporate them in our narratives and what's called storytelling. We incorporate them in our frames, and they are the base of what has been called tribal morality. And I'll stop just a second to talk about tribal morality because I think it's extremely relevant for today's politics. And I'm following here Jonathan Haidt in his book, The Righteous Mind. What Haidt has to say is that moral judgment is a case of us versus them rather than right versus wrong. So the traditional moral code is, of course, right versus wrong. But we have incorporated into the other code, the political code, we would say, so the Schmittian code of us versus them. And then Jonathan Haidt says, I think he makes a language game which I like. He says that morality binds and blinds. It binds us to the group and blinds us to the point of view of outsiders. So this is precisely the point, because this has profound implications for how we might think about some of our most deeply held beliefs. For instance, it means that we believe that what we believe is less important than with whom we share those beliefs. So what's important is to be loyal to the tribe, right? Not to be loyal to an argument or moral conviction. Probably all of you have heard this jingoist expression, right or wrong, my country. Or my country, right or wrong. So which implies it doesn't matter if it's unjust. It's my country and I ought to defend it, right? So that's tribal morality. So post-truth and tribal epistemology. So the problem here is how do feelings interfere with factual reality? I will not enter into the question of post-truth because we will debate it more specifically in another lecture. So, but I want to bring in the discussion on feelings or on emotions with the concept of post-truth, because people tend to equate post-truth to fake news, or to lies themselves. Whereas what we understand by post-truth is somehow that what matters is not what is real, but what feels real. So whoever feels more intensely will also be instilled with more reason, which is contradictory to the concept of reason, of course. So it's not just that we have become indifferent to truth, or that truth doesn't matter. What matters is only our truth. And that's precisely the point. So another pathology, apart from this post-truth syndrome, is what we may call, and I love this play with words, the fictionalization of facts and the factification of fiction, what we may also call multimedia hybridization. And it has two dimensions. The first dimension is when we lose the distinction between reality and fiction, right? And I have here one example where you can see it. So this is of course the picture underneath is from House of Cards, and that's from a scene that took place before the other picture on top. That's when we see Putin meeting President Trump. So what's interesting about this? The interesting thing about this is that we can see in a fiction something that we will later on face in real life. Okay. So and then, what do we find a better explanation of of the White House politics or American politics in general, in House of Cards or in the newspapers or in our echo chambers? Where? And as you know, we keep on changing screens. And so we don't know, when we change the screen, we don't know if we're entering into fiction or if we're entering into reality. And this is continuously happening, and sometimes I'm being surprised by students who have prejudices that they have incorporated by watching TV. Okay, and then the other dimension is what have been called alternative facts. Alternative facts, or the idea of truth decay, of post-facticity, tribal epistemology. So this is when you invent facts, right? So it's when you factify fictions in a certain way, and this has a lot to do with something that's happening, and I think we have to recognize it. It's the declining trust in formally respected sources of factual information. I think that's a fact, and that's something that populists are benefiting from when they talk about the fake news on part of, remember Donald Trump, when he talked about the CNN, Washington Post, the New York Times, it's all fake news, right? So it was also a term that was used in Germany on part of the extreme right, so the Lügenpresse. So it's the press of lies. So this is this other dimension of fictionalization of facts, factification of fiction. Okay, what's quite serious is this other dimension, the dimension of the potential manipulation or control of emotions, because emotions are there, have always been there. The problem is when they can be controlled on part of political actors. So what has been perhaps the most relevant change that these new technologies have brought about? And I think the most relevant change has to do with the following: that individual preferences, desires, and thoughts, which were previously only accessible to individuals themselves, are now open to external observers. So our minds are no longer a black box, so that no one can look into ourselves. We are constantly leaving our preferences online through our digital footprint. So we don't need to say what our preferences are, because someone already knows what they are. So people who want to manipulate the elections use our weaknesses and our fears against us. And this is happening mainly through bots, through information that we get, the way we are being as we're being, or we might be influenced by commercials, by this what we may call economic surveillance. We're also being attacked by what we may call political surveillance. And here I have a quote by Yuval Harari. This is a marvelous article, Why Technology Favors Tyranny, which he presented in The Atlantic. And he says the following: once somebody gains the technological ability to manipulate the human heart reliably, cheaply, and at scale, democratic politics will mutate into an emotional puppet show. Sounds dramatic, but it will be done, probably. At least Harari has no doubt about it. He wrote also recently something regarding this last year, the COVID crisis, and what he said this in an interview with El País. What he said is, we will not remember 2020, we will not remember the virus because of COVID-19. We will remember the virus because it was the time when the state started to control us, in all aspects of our lives. So this is when everything is starting. In order to control simply a health situation, sanitary situation, we may slowly switch over to something different. I want to underline this position. We don't have much time, so I'll try to be quick. So I'd like to say something more about this economic and political surveillance. Regarding economic surveillance, I think the book by Shoshana Zuboff is really marvelous, and you have to read it, although it's a thick book. It's called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. I think it's already a contemporary classic. But this other book with the rather dramatic title, How Democracy Dies, by David Runciman, I think it's also worthwhile reading, precisely in that part when he talks about political surveillance. Those are quotes from that book. And I think this quote you should stick. I mean, you should put above or on your computer. To search is to be searched. The more you want to know, the more someone knows about you. This is the message. So whenever we go online to dig up new information for ourselves, we end up handing over more information about ourselves to all sorts of interested parties. And the problem is that we don't know who they are. Because when we give information to the state, to government, we know to whom we're giving information. And we know the control mechanisms that there are in order for government not to overdo with make a reckless use of that information. But the problem is that we don't know who gets that information. How can we tell when a search for information will morph into an opportunity for further manipulation? As you see, these are some of the problems. So, up to now, we have seen the bottle, so to say, half empty, right? So we've only seen the bad part. And now maybe we should look at the other side. We should try to see the bottle, so this restructuring of the public sphere from another perspective. So the question that I'd like to put is, well, is this really that bad for democracy? Is this as serious as it seems? I remember quite recently, no longer than a month ago, perhaps, this article by Timothy Snyder, who is a historian that I do really respect, that had the title, Social Media Are Fascism. Is that really so? I mean, is that true? So, again, should we dramatize or are things not as bad as they seem? So, I think we should put two further questions. First, what is really new? What has really changed? Because as a political scientist, what I realize more and more is that I know this quote by George Santayana, the Spanish-American philosopher, who said, the more I change, the more I am the same. Which express very well what happens when we live, no? and we see how time passes. So the more we see politics change, the more they are the same. So politics in the end don't change that much. So if you read Machiavelli today, Machiavelli has still quite a lot to tell us about what's going on, or even Aristotle, right? So what's really new? Are these new technologies putting everything upside down or not? Because we might have fallen into what we may call a golden age syndrome, that every past has always been better than the present. Well, I think we have lots of problems. I want to say it beforehand, but maybe they're not. Maybe we're not on the brink of disaster. So, but this is, I think I don't have time really to answer in depth the first question, what is really new? But the second question, I think, is even more relevant, which is, so who is really benefiting from this situation? And then there's another question, which I won't answer because I don't have the time, but which I hope that the seminar as a whole gives an answer to it, which is, what have we lost and what have we gained? I think it's, in order to make a balance, so to say, okay, so what's lost? So we have to say goodbye to maybe to certain political practices or whatever, and have we gained, this process something? Is there something that is really worthwhile, that's better than what we knew, or just on the contrary? So what is really new? Well, there are not so many things that seem to be new if we look at it in detail. What we find is that the segmentation of the public sphere, I started with this. Segmentation of the public sphere has always been one of its features, just like being public sphere asymmetric, defectual, that the actual possibilities for political action, for political judgment, are not really fairly distributed. So the asymmetries have always been there. I think, so therefore we have to think about the traditional media. Traditional media were also partisan media. So newspapers started being partisan newspapers. They used to defend the proposals of a certain political party. I think that's quite obvious. They changed later on, but you know, this golden age of traditional media, I think I mean, never really existed. Never really existed. I think the problem is not how far the public sphere has been transformed. I think the point, you know, what should interest us is that there is enough space for a plurality of opinions and for an understanding, the basics of ordinary democratic life. On the other hand, we still have the press. I mean, my refuge when following American politics has been the New York Times and the Washington Post, right? So, and they're there. I mean, they have not disappeared because of social media. They have not disappeared because of WhatsApp or whatever, right? So in that sense, we have the old system living together with this new noise of social media and the internet in general. So I think the problem is, how can we muddle through the noise in this new kind of conflicts? Second point is, well, as I said at the beginning, the public sphere is the place where we interact with each other, where we deliberate, where we discuss public of common interest. So the question here is if there's enough deliberation to counteract what I've called the noise. And I think it's important that we stop a bit and think about how political convictions do really work. Because maybe we have put too much hopes in deliberation, in rational deliberation, as a means to achieve rational agreement. So we have perhaps confused the argumentative uses of speech with the strategic uses of speech. And in politics, the strategic uses of speech are, of course, more present than the argumentative uses of speech, except in situations such as ours, because we are free to discuss through arguments, of course. So I think it's empirically, has been empirically demonstrated that the possibilities of being convinced through rational arguments are scarce. Now and then, you know, the supposed golden age of the public sphere. The best argument doesn't necessarily win for many reasons, and I picked up, because it's from 1961, it seems to be written yesterday. It's from Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno. It's from 1961, I repeat, when he talks of the narcissism of opinion, and he says, how can you convince someone of the rationality of something if this person, if persons are not ready to start by abandoning their previous stance? Our conversational partner must at least be willing to listen, and that is precisely what she will not do if she does not want to be contaminated by the opinion of others. Okay, so we don't really want to be convinced. So political conviction doesn't happen except in political upheavals, in economic crisis, under accelerated social change. Do people change their political positions? But if not, people tend to keep their political positions. They may change them, but to closer positions. So one can move from one rightist party to another rightist party. So to make the move to the Greens, for instance, from part of the rightist party is not that simple, although it can happen, of course, because people tend to change their mind, but there are no sharp turns. No matter how much the contribution of the opposing forces is rationally overwhelming. So you might have the best speech and nevertheless not achieve the possibility of convincing people of your position. So political debate is not about exchanging arguments in the end, it's about presenting arguments. Have you ever realized, have you ever watched a parliamentary debate when the opposition says to government after a speech on part of the government or after a discussion, we're going to change our votes. You have convinced us. Marvelous arguments. Oh, yes, we'll change. Never, ever. So what do they do that? Well, they do it in order to present to the public so that the public knows how those that they have voted argue about something of which they are already convinced. So that's more or less how it works, right? So I think that in that sense, this has always happened, and this is now happening, even though using stronger means, so to say. So let's switch to the other question that I wanted to give an answer to. So I'll be very quick because we're out of time. If not, we won't have enough time for debate. So, qui prodest, as we would say in Latin, well, as we may say in Latin, who benefits from this situation? And I think there's a clear beneficiary, and this explains in part the success of populist discourses that have contaminated even the way that other political forces bring into public opinion. I think populism has greatly benefited from this restructuring of the public sphere, and they are actively contributing to restructure it again and again. So why? Because populism is not really, even though some of my colleagues tend to see populism as a thin ideology, as they say, I think it's not so much an ideology, it is mainly a political mobilization strategy. It's a rhetoric. And this mobilization strategy, this rhetoric it's being put into practice through performative activism, through public intervention, through communications of all kinds, in framing stereotypes that facilitate the construction of a we in construct to another, to an opponent. So populism discourse is based on the possibility of fostering divisions and polarization. I like this sentence by Jan Werner Müller, one of the greatest experts on populism nowadays, so that when he says that symbolic gestures come to trump slow and hard thinking. So the symbolic gestures, the polarizing gestures, communications, polarizing rhetoric on part of the populists foster emotions, foster the simplification of messages, fosters what we may call quick thinking, instead of slow and hard thinking. Thinking fast and slow, you know, this book by Kahneman, which became a bestseller. So fast thinking is, thinking, through sound bites almost that affect you immediately. That's through presenting the other side as being unworthy of being voted, of identifying yourself with the whole country, etc., etc. So what my conclusion, therefore, is that we may not have changed that much, but the change is worrisome, because this changes in our communication media, these changes in the public sphere are no doubt the perfect instruments for unreason, for sheer emotional judgments, and for the fostering of not just polarization, but even hate speech. So if we have a look at what we see in the social media, and there are of course lots of studies where we can find that, then what we really find is we have to conclude that, therefore, that this is not fostering arguments, this is not fostering rationality, it's fostering more a primary way of doing politics. Thanks very much. And I'll see, we can go to the questions. Okay, apparently the audio is working, so even if you can't see me, we may go on with the discussion. I'll be getting your questions through WhatsApp. There are some. The first question is by Paula Muriedo. She asks, Hannah Arendt talked about the fabric of actuality. The creation of alternative realities was an instrument used in the last century by totalitarian regimes. For example, the Lügenpresse, fake news of the Nazi regime. Nowadays, post-truth is accelerated due to the digital transition. How can we find a common ground for discussion when emotions matter more than facts? Yeah, well, it's a very good question, but I think the question nowadays is not so much as with totalitarian regimes, where the point was that the one creating fake news was government, was the regime. The one who controlled all sources of power was indeed the state. Nowadays, fake news are produced by everyone, or by almost everyone, by all parties. Fake news are the products of press releases, are the products of bots, are the products of even political parties. So it's difficult really to rely on some of the information. But this doesn't mean that we cannot achieve the truth. And I think you quoted Hannah Arendt, and Hannah Arendt, what she says is that democracy itself is incompatible with the truth in a strict sense. And she meant that democracy is a regime or the government of opinion. And opinion is the opposite of truth. But that our opinions should be based on objective facts. So facts are true or untrue, but we cannot apply that to opinions, right? So opinions can be more or less convincing, but we cannot say that opinions are truthful, right? So they might be backed by better arguments, of course, but that doesn't mean that they are backed by the true arguments. So in that sense, we should take care that that we have sources that present us real facts, so the true facts, and then from then on we can construct different opinions, which is usually what happens. Then there are other questions. One is supposedly some of you have made the same question: if individual freedom is being threatened by using or by manipulating our emotions, isn't it a threat to liberal democracy, which is based on the individual sovereignty of the citizen? Of course it is. Yeah, so it's the greatest threat. So that's why when I referred to it in my presentation, I wanted to underline that it is precisely here where we have to face the greatest challenge. But there are ways to fight it. And so, and we've recently witnessed one way of doing it. Remember, after the assault on the American Capitol in Washington, on part of some of Trump followers, the still president of the United States was his communication through Twitter had been broken. So in that sense, I think if we are capable of regulating those news media, if we're capable of counteracting the amazing power of this huge corporation that controls the internet, then I think there will be a chance that we might be protected against all this new ways of trying not just to manipulate your emotions, but to manipulate facts and manipulate everything that might be of value or might be relevant for politics. And I think that's a threat that there is. Yes, certainly. Okay, let's see if there are more questions. Carmen Hormigo, my impression is that the political discourse shows a total lack of connection with the citizens. That is why I believe that there is a lack of commitment and moral convictions, and that permeates the citizenry and harms liberal democracies. What do you think will be possible evolution in the near future if this inconsistency and banality of the political discourse is not corrected? Okay, again, yes, we live certainly under a banal, frivolous, or however you may want to describe it, discourse in politics. But it's not worse than in the past. You have to consider the fact that democratic politics has been, until the appearance of the masses, in the hands of an elite, right? And even after the appearance of the masses and after mass society, what we have witnessed is precisely the appearance of leaders that took over mass parties, and that in those mass parties, those masses were certainly directed by those leaders. So in that sense, I don't think that public discourse was better or more profound. Maybe nowadays we were capable of seeing how banal it is, how inconsistent even, because the methods that are being used in order to present certain realities are based on very primary schemes of communication, right? So in that sense, I think this has a lot to do with what politics has really learned from publicity, right? So from and so this cultural industry developed into political industry of communication, and the political industry of communication is targeted towards certain parts of society, certain social groups, and depending which social group you want to target, then you use these or that other kind of messages. But I don't think we can overturn that easily. So we have to rely, as I said before, on serious media, which are mainly the serious press. But I'd like to put this in contact with what I said before regarding how this situation benefits populism. We cannot forget that the last restructuring of the public sphere happened with television. In particular, when television, at least in Europe, became private, the private channels of television appeared. Without private channels in television, Berlusconi would have been impossible. And people like Berlusconi would have never had any chance of becoming prime minister. But the possibilities that a leader using his own, in this case, his own private television channels, changing the whole political culture of a country such as Italy, has been amazing. And so I think social media are now fulfilling a similar function as we've witnessed before with television, and so nowadays I think it's private channels, for instance, most of them are in fact private. They don't fulfill that function as well as social media, and maybe social media, well, people may get bored of social media and change to something different. So we have seen how people have been evolving from Facebook to Twitter, from Twitter to Instagram, from Instagram to Telegram. I mean, I'm not an expert, I don't know the names. But they're jumping from one thing to the other. What I think that is really almost dramatic is when politics is being made, as in the case of Bolsonaro's Brazil, is made through WhatsApp. I mean, if we jump that low, then that's the end. That's the end of political discourse. That's the end, really, of introducing. I mean, that's the end of the public sphere, as such, because there's no common ground. There's no way. There's no space where we can look at each other. We can understand the position of the other. I mean, that gets lost within the noise. But I still keep a certain hope. I keep a certain hope, and my hope is based mainly on what happened in the last American elections. Even though considering what happened, in the last moment, with the assault on the Capitol, right? So, but in the end, Biden won. And if Trump would have won, maybe my presentation here would have been far more dramatic. I'm absolutely sure that we would have used another title for this seminar. It would have been probably the fragility of democracy, or the end of democracy, or the definitive crisis of democracy, or something like that. But, Biden won. So we have, we're happy about it, but we know this is we're in a transition, and so this war has not yet been won. I'm sorry to say we've come to the end of our time, but as you know, this is an ongoing discussion, and I'm sure that in the next days, next time we will have Massimo Latorre, this Italian professor who's an expert in, well, amongst lots of things, in populism, and then we'll face the greatest threat, which is to our democratic system, which is probably populism. Thanks very much again. Thank you very much again for listening and for watching, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks a lot.